It gives me a great pleasure and privilege to welcome Kareem Khalifa to our conference on understanding here. Kareem is a fantastic writer on understanding. He's based at Middlebury College, and he is notoriously good-natured, and he's just a fantastic person, not just a fantastic philosopher. And his talk is titled "Should Friends and Frenemies of Understanding Be Friends?" And Karim, I believe this is part of a joint project that you have with Heng Degeg, but you're probably going to tell us much more about this. So please take it away.
Yes. Well, thank you, Andre, for that warm welcome, and thank you also for this lovely opportunity to share ideas. So yes, as Andre mentioned, this is part of an exchange with Henk de Recht. And I apologize, Henk and I have been talking about these issues for the better part of a decade. So there may very well be things that are sort of lurking in the background that I'm taking for granted, but please feel free to ask questions about those. So let me tell you a little bit about my history with Henk. In my first publication in which I discussed his work, I I don't know what I describe it as, playfully described him as a friend of understanding. And I think it was already clear then that I was what I might describe as a frenemy of understanding. And I'll explain what I mean by those things. And so we've always had a good-natured back and forth that's mostly been kicking the tires on each other's views and things like that. I'm going to do something a little bit different today, which is I'm really going to try and show you how we might actually reconcile our views. And I should say that there's a longer version of this in the written version of this talk. I'm only going to focus really on a third, and it's essentially the place where I think we seem most at odds, and I'm going to suggest even here we're not really that far apart once we start scrutinizing our views a little bit more. And the main sticking point, as you'll see, is the relationship between understanding and truth. So what I'll do is I'll just give you a little bit of background to start off, and this part of the talk, I'm going to give you a baseline that I call the explanatory floor, and I'll explain what I mean by that. And that's going to sort of serve as a touchstone for understanding points of potential departure between Henk and myself. Then I'm going to characterize what I take Henk's understanding of our differences to be. And I'm going to suggest that this doesn't quite accurately capture how flexible my view is about the relationship between understanding and truth. And what's going to emerge are two positions that are both compatible with my views. That I'll call explanatory anti-realism and explanatory realism. Henk is naturally seen as an explanatory anti-realist, and Daniel Wilkenfeld is going to characterize me as an explanatory realist, but I'm actually cool with either position once we start to sweat the details. So what I'm going to do is dispel what might seem like apparent tensions between my view in explanatory anti-realism and Henk's view in explanatory realism, and then we'll tap out. So first of all, what do I mean when I describe myself as a frenemy of understanding? Right? The core idea is that understanding isn't fundamental, that it's essentially derivative of knowledge and explanation. This has a long history in certainly the philosophy of science, and I think even as Stephen was suggesting, you might find precursors to this in Aristotle to some degree. So John Greco's written a very nice essay defending that view. So summarizing my book in a crude equation, it goes something like this, right? To understand why P is sort of like, approximately like scientific knowledge that Q correctly explains why P, right? So an example of this would be, for instance, to understand why people get ulcers is to have scientific knowledge that H. pylori, a bacteria, explains why people get ulcers. It causes them to have ulcers. Now, I'm essentially not going to say anything about justification and belief in this talk. In the longer version, what I argue is that Henk and I actually have ways of filling in various gaps in each of our views about those particular issues, and in particular, what might be thought of as justification. I'm going to focus on a consequence of this, which is that understanding why P requires having a correct explanation of P. That's what I call the explanatory floor. All right, so let me just talk you through what the floor does and does not entail. So first of all, note that it's a thesis about understanding why something is the case, and it's agnostic about other kinds of understanding. Furthermore, I'm going to restrict P to empirical propositions, paradigmatically the ones that we find in science. Having a correct explanation is basically going to be any kind of cognitive attitude, so it can be belief, it can be acceptance, it can be credence, what have you. Not too many details are going to hinge on that. Correctness is something that's going to be essentially the contested term, or an essentially contested term, perhaps in this discussion. So I'm just going to bracket it for now and just have it as a placeholder. Explanation, I'm going to be fairly pluralistic, so I'm not restricting this to causal explanation. It's basically explanations as we find them in science. And that's basically the rough idea behind the floor. Now, crucially, Henk stands alongside me on the explanatory floor. He says that understanding a phenomenon is identical to having an adequate explanation of the phenomenon. And so I think the only real difference you might see here is between the words adequacy and correctness. Once again, that's going to be the placeholder, and I take it what both Henk and I are concerned about when we modify the word explanation in this way is we don't want crappy explanations to provide understanding. And so you might think of our differences as a difference about what counts as a crappy explanation. So that's the backdrop at which, the common ground on which Henk and I stand. And now what I want to do is sort of characterize our differences against that backdrop. So there's Henk, and there's a really handsome guy. And I'm going to begin by characterizing what I take Henk's understanding of our disagreement to be. And I take it he sees himself roughly as what I'll call an explanatory anti-realist, and I'll unpack what that means. And then what I take Henk's characterization of my view to be is one of explanatory realism. But before I do that, for those of you who are well-versed in the understanding literature, I'm going to make a brief terminological intervention. I'm going to put the kibosh, as it were, on the F word. And by that, I don't mean that F word, but rather this F word, factive. I think it's led to a number of confusions. I think different people are intervening on this debate with different sort of theoretical backgrounds and motivations in mind. And I think we're talking past each other. I think what clinched it for me is I had a really nice email exchange with Angela Potocznik, who describes herself as a non-factivist, and she actually has stronger truth conditions on explanation than I do. So that was when I decided I was done using the F word. Instead, I'm going to use these terms explanatory, anti-realism, and realism, and define them hopefully with some precision, at least precise enough to characterize the differences between Henk and myself. So Henk, as I said, seems broadly congenial to what I would call explanatory anti-realism. So here's a fairly representative quote, which says, "We can have genuine understanding of phenomena on the basis of theories and models that defy realistic interpretation." Right? And here's how I think I would characterize Henk's view. So as I noted, he's committed to the explanatory floor, which, just to remind you, says that understanding a phenomenon requires having a correct explanation of that phenomenon. Right? And then I take it he's going to put a broad characterization, not a complete characterization, on explanatory correctness as follows. Right? So in the formulation, Q explains why P. Q is what we call the explanans. P is what we call the explanandum. And what he's going to say is sometimes you have a correct explanation, but the explanans is false. And we'll explain why he says that in a bit. And that, of course, is going to be compatible then with what a lot of people would want to call non-factive understanding, but I'm not going to use that word anymore, right? The idea that false explanantia, the plural of explanans, right, provides understanding in some cases. And I take it then that Henk takes me to be an explanatory realist. So like him, I start on the explanatory floor and I work my way up, and I say, I don't want to characterize correct explanation in the same way that he does. He takes me to hold that whenever you have a correct explanation, your explanans has to be approximately true. And of course, that's then going to mean that only approximately true explanantia can provide understanding. However, I don't think this is my view. Here's one thing I said in my book, which is I can't stress enough that I'm not taking a stance on the realism issue. And I think more pivotally, for my purposes, is what amounts to the official theory of explanation in my book has a pretty judicious notion of quality control on the explanans. It says Q correctly explains why P only if Q satisfies your ontological requirements so long as they're reasonable. And Henk and I are both, I think, thinking of understanding with the scientific realism debates in the background. And so when I talk about what I consider examples of reasonable ontological requirements on an explanation, I highlight Bas van Fraassen, who's arguably the preeminent scientific anti-realist, who holds that you only need to have theories that save the phenomena, but that can be false about unobservable stuff at sort of one end of that continuum. And then garden variety scientific realists like Stathis Psillos on the other. And in between are people like structural realists and entity realists. We'll talk a little bit about those intermediate positions a little bit later in the talk. But the idea is there's a spectrum of views in the scientific realism debate. And so long as it's sort of one of the live contenders, I'm fine with that. And very roughly, my thought behind this was just there should be a way of talking about understanding without settling what seems like a pretty high-level debate in the philosophy of science. where you can remain agnostic about those issues. For other reasons, I use the F word, and I regret that now because I think it's promoted a lack of finding commonality between our views. So one way you might characterize my view then is I'm really committed only to the explanatory floor, and if you want to be a realist, that's fine by me. And if you want to be an anti-realist, that's fine by me. There's going to be certain kinds of adjustments you need to make. I think that the common construal then is that the anti-realist has a more capacious notion of understanding than the realist. I'm going to suggest that it's actually not that straightforward, right? But for present purposes, I want to just be clear that I'm neither a realist nor an anti-realist. I'm going to use the word voluntarism to describe what I'm doing. This is an oblique hat tip to Anjan Chakravarty and Bas van Frassen's work, where they basically think that there's a range of permissible options when it comes to debates about scientific ontology. I'm not going to buy this view hook, line, and sinker, but it's a useful handle, and I can discuss some of the ways in which I'm somewhat qualified in my voluntarism if one wants. But at any rate, let's think about now what it means to be a voluntarist as a frenemy, and to be in conversation with a friend of understanding like Henk, who doesn't think that knowledge is merely derivative. Understanding is merely derivative of knowledge and explanation, right? So what this is going to mean is, as a voluntarist, it's perfectly okay with me if Henk wants to be an anti-realist, but it would be perfectly okay with me if he wanted to be a realist too. And so I think this raises two natural questions, which is, can frenemies actually be anti-realists? You might be already anticipating a worry here, and I'm going to try to dispel what seems to me the obvious worry in a minute. But the other question is, can Henk be okay with me tolerating realism as another live option? And basically what I'm going to do now is spend the rest of the talk answering these two questions. And basically the answer to both is yes. So let's start with the idea that frenemies can be anti-realists. And I think here's the intuition that makes people think otherwise. It looks something like an argument, but I'm going to suggest it falls short of that. So if you're a frenemy, pretty clearly you think that understanding is a species of knowledge. Obviously, we know that knowledge entails truth. And at this point, you think to yourself, you're committed to truth. Therefore, you have to be an explanatory realist. And I want to suggest that this last move is just far too quick, right? And I'll try to explain why. So as a frenemy, the only kind of knowledge I claim that you have to have, right, is knowledge of an explanation, knowledge that Q explains why P. And of course, that then has implications for my truth requirement, right? It's got to be then that it's true that Q explains why P. And here I mean correctly explains, just to be clear. But now let's think about what it would mean to deny, right, that it's true that Q explains why P. It would be to say that Q does not explain why P. It's not to say anything about explanatory anti-realism, if you recall, right? What that's to say is that it's like if you deny, right, this truth condition right here, what you're denying is the explanatory floor, right? There's nothing about this which actually says anything about realism or anti-realism. It's just a question of whether you think understanding why entails explanation or not. And that's certainly a debate that can be had. So Peter Lipton has some very interesting arguments to this effect, which I've discussed in my book and elsewhere. But that's not the realism issue, is crucially what I'm saying, is there's nothing about this which is incompatible with being a frenemy of understanding, right, or an anti-realist. So this looks like it's an option, and essentially what's going to happen in these cases is if you're an explanatory anti-realist and a frenemy, what you're going to say is, when you understand, you know that Q explains why P, but there's going to be certain cases in which you don't know that Q because it's false, right? And that's going to be the kind of view you have. You may have questions about this as a semantics for explanatory statements, but that's, I think, once again, just to go way up on the ladder and start litigating the scientific realism debate to some degree. And I've made this argument repeatedly. In fact, my first publication on understanding was called Knowledge, Understanding, and Scientific Anti-Realism, where I developed this probably in the greatest detail that I have anywhere. But I've made it in a number of other places, including in my book, in conversation with Henk's view. So I don't think that there's any hurdle to being a frenemy of understanding and being an anti-realist. That's one possible move, and as I said, I'm also okay being a realist. And so for this, I now want to try to show you that Henk himself might embrace this. And I should say, Henk is somewhat ambiguous or ambivalent, maybe having talked to him in person about this or over Zoom about this a little bit. There are times where he says, like, he too doesn't want to take a stance on the realism debate in print, but then it looks like the actual formulation of his views does commit him to a certain kind of anti-realism. So what I want to do is, first of all, get clear about where Hank's reservations about explanatory realism lie. And I'm going to suggest that this sharpens up what his anti-realism would have to be. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through an example in the early stages of the standard model in particle physics, Bjorken scaling, which looks very amenable to Hank's view, and show you that you could give a realist interpretation of it without loss. Right? So let's get clear about Hank's objection to scientific realism. So for those of you who don't know, that's Stathis Silos' book on scientific realism. And yes, I've characterized Hank in flattering ways. So here's the idea in a nutshell, right? That basically, I think Hank is worried about this. If you subscribe to explanatory realism, you're going to have too restrictive a notion of explanation to make sense of all the obvious cases of understanding why in science. That's the intuition behind it. I'll try to sharpen that up a little bit with some of the machinery I've introduced. Right? So you might pitch Hank's objection to explanatory realists this way. Look, we're committed to the explanatory floor, which says that understanding a phenomenon requires a correct explanation of that phenomenon. And if you're furthermore committed to explanatory realism, that means that to have a correct explanation is to have an approximately true explanans. And then it looks like only true explanantia can provide understanding, right? And this was essentially how I characterized explanatory realism earlier in the talk. But then Hank notes, as I said, there seem to be examples in the history of science and in contemporary science where we have false explanantia providing understanding. Hank's two favorite examples of this are Newtonian mechanics, which obviously was superseded by relativistic and quantum mechanics, as well as the use of idealizations, for example, by Boltzmann when he uses the dumbbell model to make sense of the specific heat ratios of diatomic gases. The details of those don't matter. And I'm going to, in fact, use a different example than those, though I'm happy to discuss those examples as well. Now, because we both stand on the floor together, right, the only thing that can give in this case is explanatory realism, and so that's where we end up. Right? Now, crucially, you might have noticed I moved rather freely between talking about truth in the strict sense and approximate truth, and I think this actually makes a difference in this particular case. Right? Explanatory realists are only committed to approximate truth, and once again, this is a hat tip to basically half a century's worth of debate in the scientific realism literature that once again, I think is where both Hank and I are drawing our respective positions. Right? And so then I'm trying to just come up with an antonym to approximately true. I'm going to call it massively false as a placeholder, but note that what this does is this ups the ante for what it means for incorrect explanantia to provide understanding. I'm going to suggest that there's at least some realist-friendly ways of resisting the second premise in Hank's argument. In particular, what I'm going to suggest is this is the kind of anti-realism that Hank needs to subscribe to. It's the idea that to say that a massively false explanans provides understanding is to say that it's an explanans that gets nothing right about any of its posited unobservables, and that's still capable of providing understanding. So why am I attributing this to Hank? For that, we need to turn to his account of understanding. This is the criterion for understanding phenomena, or CUP for short. Crucially for our purposes, CUP is presented as providing both necessary and, this is really the crucial part, sufficient conditions for understanding. So what Hank says is to understand a phenomenon, first and foremost, you need a potential explanation of the phenomenon. Like me, he's an explanatory pluralist, so that can be causal, that can be deductive nomological, that can be unifying, etc. We can mostly just black box what the exact explanatory relationship is. Obviously, this isn't sufficient, but it's necessary if you're committed to the explanatory floor, like both Hank and I are. You need quality control on this potential explanations because there's lots of crappy potential explanations out there. Right? So there are myths, there are conspiracy theories, so on and so forth. So Hank adds two further conditions, empirical adequacy and consistency. Right? Now, by empirical adequacy, very roughly, this means that it gets the observable parts of the explanation, or the observable consequences of the explanation, it gets right, and the unobservable parts, it can get wrong. Right? And so you can already see where this notion of anti-realism is headed. But this itself is not sufficient for Hank either. Right? There has to be a theoretical basis to the explanation. And I take it this basing relation is very roughly, I mean, you see this throughout the sciences, something that's more than inspiration but less than derivation, if I can put it that way. So you can think of it broadly as inferential, but I think it would be too strong to call it a derivation in a lot of cases. And Henk has lots of interesting things to say about that. Right? But of course, not any old theory will do the job. In addition, right, Henk requires that it's intelligible, and I'll represent that with these chalkboard arrows. So intelligibility gets two glosses on Henk's view. The first of these is what he calls the macro level conception of intelligibility. And very roughly, that notion of intelligibility is the value that scientists attach to a cluster of properties of a theory that facilitate the use of it for the construction of explanatory models. Right? And generally, the kind of cluster of qualities he has in mind are the traditional theoretical virtues like simplicity, scope, fruitfulness, and so on. But the more interesting one is the meso-level conception of intelligibility. This is characterized as follows, right? A theory is intelligible to scientists if they can recognize the theory's characteristic qualitative consequences without performing exact calculations. Right? So very roughly, when you can engage in the sort of effortless qualitative reasoning with a theory, you've got a feel for the theory, and we associate that with intelligibility and understanding. Right? But we can now see, right, why it looks like this brand of anti-realism is really what Henk is committed to, because, as I said, Cup provides sufficient conditions on understanding, and he has nothing, no constraints on how accurate the theory needs to be about unobservable things. Hence, we get that view. So what I'm going to do now is basically walk you through an example from the early history of the Standard Model, which looks very amenable to Henk's view. And I'm going to show you, you can interpret it Henk's way. I'm not going to say much about that. I'm just going to sort of grant that you can interpret it Henk's way. But you can also interpret it in a realist way. And so I don't think very much hinges on making a decision of these sorts that should worry Henk too much. So just to give you a little bit of historical background, the Standard Model is basically the going model in particle physics. Its great theoretical achievement is unifying the strong, weak, and electromagnetic forces. Its characteristic theoretical entities are quarks and gluons, but you might be more familiar with things like the Higgs boson from recent media coverage and things like that. But we're going to go back to the very early days. Right? So in the early 60s and through the mid-60s, basically, the core ideas of the Standard Model were being formulated. Theorists were putting forward ideas about quarks, and similar sorts of models. And they were mostly just interesting theoretical ideas, but they didn't have much empirical evidence going for them at that point. And you can see Bjorken, who's going to be one of the heroes of our story, as basically part of that movement. Right? He was doing some interesting theoretical work. He was a theorist at Stanford. In the background, you can see the Stanford Linear Accelerator, which will play a role in but a moment in '67. And so he had this interesting model of hadronic structure, where hadrons are just things like protons and neutrons. Right? Now, shares in the Standard Model started to accrue, basically, when there started to be some really suggestive early experimental results from the experimenters at Stanford, who independently, actually, and it's not even clear with knowledge of Bjorken's model, started running some really interesting scattering experiments. So what they're doing here is they're firing electron beams at a proton target. And the prevailing wisdom of the time, this is quantum electrodynamics, basically said that protons are soft. And so what that means is when you get into the deep inelastic region, which is basically where your beam angle and your beam velocity start increasing, you should start to see a drop-off on the stuff that comes ricocheting off the proton. Right? They didn't see that. It remained more or less consistent even in the deep inelastic scattering results. This suggests a hard proton, right? Perhaps speaking somewhat ahead of time or anachronistically, right? Perhaps there's quarks in these things, right? Bjorken himself said, like, I'm not that surprised by this. My model from '66 actually predicts this. Right? And he said, and furthermore, if you guys could do me a favor, because we're colleagues at Stanford, can you plot these two curves for me, please? And sure enough, they did. And you can guess by the name that it was a predictive success. These are called Bjorken scaling curves. Right? Essentially, what these say is you're going to see certain invariances in proton structure across a very, very wide range of scattering experiments. This was a striking predictive success, particularly at this stage of development for the standard model. Main problem, the experimenters did not understand Bjorken's model at all, right? At all might be too strong, but there was deep concern that they just didn't understand what was going on. It was couched in fairly abstract mathematics. And so this looks like a very nice case then for theorists of understanding to sink their teeth into. And what you see is actually just a little bit later, Richard Feynman comes strolling in from Pasadena to Palo Alto, and he says, "Oh, okay, I can kind of see what's going on with Bjorken's model. Let me see if this makes sense to you." And sure enough, it did. So let me give you a little bit of a sampling of how Feynman was approaching this. And I think what you'll see is this very nicely evinces Hank's notion that qualitative reasoning is a crucial part of this, right? So this is coming from The Hunting of the Quark by Michael Riordan, who was an experimental physicist at Stanford at the time. He says, Feynman looked at electron scattering not from the familiar perspective of a stationary proton target, but from the viewpoint of the onrushing electron probe. Riding a speeding electron beam at relativistic velocities, Feynman could see the uprushing protons flattened into thin pancakes, right? So we're starting to get the qualitative reasoning going on here. Feynman keeps on going, and he says, like, all right, if you peer into those pancakes and do a few theoretical moves called impulse approximation, you're going to see that there's these 3 point-like particles inside of them, which he called partons. We now call them quarks. And Bjorken scaling is basically describing certain invariances in the momentum distribution of those partons. Right? So the experimental physicists love this, and this ends up being a dominant trope that you see in a lot of experimental tests of the standard model. It's much easier, right, to basically think of subatomic particles as classical particles, right? In fact, calling them particles already is sort of not entirely accurate, right? But to think of things like electrons and protons, right, as behaving a lot like billiard balls smashing into each other. This is a really useful heuristic for experimental design. But if you know even a little bit about quantum mechanics, you know that this is actually not correct, that this is false. Right? So it looks like we have a nice example that's going to fit Hank's template relatively well. Right? So just to fill it in really quickly, right? We see that we have the parton explanation from Feynman. That's explaining Bjorken scaling. We can talk about the details of the explanation if you want. It was empirically adequate and consistent. It was based in quantum mechanics, and I think we have a sense now of the qualitative reasoning that was going on. We have these pancakes and these particles and so on and so forth. And you might think because it makes such a great departure from quantum mechanics, right, that there's something about it, right, that satisfies Hank's notion of explanatory anti-realism. Right? I want to suggest you could interpret it that way, or at least say it doesn't matter that it got things right about the unobservable parts of the hadron. But there's another way you can go, which is just to deny that, and you can make sense of this episode as well. So here you're going to say, well, all right, the explanons got something right about at least one of its posited unobservables, right? Or if you don't want to individuate the unobservables, that's also fine. And in that case, you end up with what I would consider, and I think Hank would have to consider to be an approximately true explanation of what's going on. So let me show you two places where this seems to pop up. The first is actually in the very design of the experiment. Virtually all of the theorists and experimenters are just taking it for granted, right, that it's electrons, right, interacting with protons. Right? This is just not even something that's commented on. And I think this fits very well for those of you familiar with the scientific realism literature, with the entity realism or the experimental realism championed by folks like Nancy Cartwright and Ian Hacking in the early 1980s. Right? But we can peer even further and see that even when it comes to the partons, which are here represented as quarks with a Q, right? There's a story to be told where you at least hit that minimal realist threshold. Right? And here's roughly how it goes. You can find this in Tianyu Kao's book, From Current Algebra to Quantum Chromodynamics. And the story goes something like this, right? If you're a realist, what ends up being frequently a benchmark of when you should have confidence that you're latching onto unobservable reality is basically when your theory makes what's called a novel prediction, where it makes a prediction and it wasn't actually involved in the design of the test or anything like that. So there's what's called the no miracles intuition when this happens, right? It's sort of would be miraculous if you got nothing right about the unobservable world and still managed to make these predictions which are completely unexpected otherwise. So you get that with Bjorken, and in particular with the scaling curves. But I think even there's a case to be made that he has what's called a use novel prediction with deep inelastic scattering results. So what that means if you're a structural realist is there's some mathematical structure in your model, right, which is isomorphic to unobservable reality. And then furthermore, what we can say is Feynman's model is basically just embedding Bjorken's model within it. This is just a certain feature of it. In fact, it's not even clear that it's an embedding. A lot of people take these to be notational variants of each other. Bjorken himself actually anticipated a lot of the key ideas in the parton model and just didn't emphasize them. Okay, so you can say all of that and still say it's a useful fiction to think of electrons and partons and so on and so forth as behaving classically for the purposes of experimental design. Those things are consistent with each other. And so there's no danger there then in you can have that isomorphism and still grant that there's useful fictions in the vicinity. So it looks like the realist is allowed to basically interpret this episode without any loss in terms of saying, oh, they didn't understand this particular case. And furthermore, what I want to hammer home with respect to discussing this with Henk is note that it's that useful fiction where all the cool qualitative reasoning is happening, right? That's the most distinctively friendly part of Henk's view is this notion of intelligibility as effortless qualitative reasoning. All that gets preserved and he can be a realist. So the thought isn't that he should be a realist. It's just in fact, I want him to be a voluntarist like me, just to say this issue really doesn't matter one way or the other. And what I'm suggesting then is that the realism issue isn't really going to be a dividing line between friends and frenemies of understanding. So here's how I would wrap up. I want to make clear for the record that I'm a voluntarist, not a realist. And as I noted, my theory of explanation in my book, I think is pretty explicit about this. And so what does this mean in terms of my decade-long discussion with Henk? Well, it means that he can either join Team Voluntarism or tell me why anti-realism is basically the only game in town when it comes to understanding. And I think this is the part of the talk which I wish I had another 20 minutes to share with you. On virtually all other aspects of understanding, our views are complementary, and I see I have a minute or two, so I'll just briefly explain this. So on my view, there's a process of considering plausible candidates for explanation, and I think actually Henk's view does a better job of articulating the reasoning behind that. A lot of it deals with this qualitative reasoning, and he has actually a relatively liberal notion of empirical adequacy and consistency, which is what I think you need at this stage of consideration. I then also have an additional stage in which you have to go about comparing these candidate explanations, which requires a more demanding notion of empirical adequacy. And so I think I help out Henk there so that he can basically rule out things that seem to be misunderstandings in science. But I'll just leave it there and say thank you. And I assume Henk is not in the audience, but I always want to thank Henk for all the great conversations that we've had.
Thank you so much, Kareem. And I never hesitate to use the applause button when it comes to your talks. I should say that Henk couldn't make it today, unfortunately, because he had another talk that he had committed to beforehand. But he will be giving a talk at CELFIS in December. I managed to book him book him for that. So please stay tuned for our program next week, next academic year. Also next week, sure. And thanks so much. And so let's see if there's some questions for Kareem already. If you can raise your virtual hand. Let me break the ice by asking a quick question of my own. Well, I don't need to. We have Professor Mikja Dumitru. Please go ahead. We're listening.
No, please do, Andrei. No, you are the first, please.
Okay, well, thanks so much. So
don't fight over me, guys. Don't fight over me, please.
You have a good nature, though, so you are not going to be upset about it.
Okay, so perfect. I was thinking about something that you said earlier about quality control for the explanantia, and at the micro level, Henk also has this idea that which theories scientists choose, or which models, which theoretical models they choose to work with, in some sense is an equilibrium, there's a trade-off with respect to which cognitive skills they make most use of in using those models.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wonder if there's some kind of intellectual virtue theoretic sort of backdrop to both of your views here.
Yeah, at the tail end of my book, I sort of give a hat tip to the virtue epistemologist, really much more the virtue reliabilist, because I think Stephen and I have very similar sensibilities in this regard. Henk is not as engaged with epistemology. He's much more squarely in the philosophy of science, so I don't know what he would say about that. One thing I'm urging actually in this paper is a lot of the reliabilist kinds of elements in my account are actually, I told you at the end, the account of explanatory comparison that I have, I think actually are things that I don't see why Henk would be resistant to them, and I think they actually help him out with certain views. So I don't know how much you want me to geek out on particle physics. Yeah. I'll try to say this without getting into the gory details. One of the main competitors to the parton model was the vector meson dominance model. It's actually, I could write another paper on it just because I started geeking out on it in really interesting ways. But its main proponent was a guy named J.J. Sakurai, who was a theoretical physicist at Chicago. And he wrote a really lovely paper in, I want to say 67, 68. It was right around the same time that Feynman proposed the parton model, but he was aware of what Feynman was up to. And it's basically an incompatible view of the hadron. But one of the things he says, which sounds to me intellectually virtuous in the more responsibilist rather than reliabilist sense, is he says the main virtue of this theory is that it's easily destroyed by experiment. And what it was is it had basically a prediction where if it went one way, it was clearly going to be in favor of his model, and if it went the other way, it was clearly going to be in favor of Bjorken and Feynman's model. Interestingly enough, an experiment is run in Stanford a little bit later, and what happens on that particular Sakurai's response to this actually doesn't look so virtuous. He says, I don't know about that experiment anymore. What ends up being interesting, and I think this maybe speaks against a certain kind of intellectual virtue. It shows you how vices can also be good. He said, I'm going to stick to my guns. I'm going to revise this thing. And he came up with what are called generalized vector meson dominance models. Now, they still didn't do a particularly good job with Bjorken scaling, according to the scientific community at the time. They thought it was an ad hoc desperation move. But they've turned out to be really, really good effective theories in a bunch of other domains. And this is where I tend to wonder, this is of a piece maybe of the question I asked of Kate, which is, I tend to think, and a really nice proponent of this is, say, someone like Miriam Solomon, you can be kind of intellectually vicious on the individual level and it pays off at the collective level. That's something I don't quite know how to square. I'm actually working a bit with Sandy Goldberg on some social epistemology of science where we're not dealing with that issue per se, but it's a case where I think on Henk's view, that's going to work out nicely. His individual skills work. It actually eventually percolates up to probably not quite meso level, like somewhere in between micro and meso level understanding, because there's still you can find 20 years later people still bagging on Sakurai, even though there's these really nice effective theories of the vector meson dominance model.
Well, that's really interesting. You're doubling down not just on the felicitous falsehood stuff, but on vicious falsehoods. Right, so you're really into that.
Yeah, I mean, but what's interesting though is when you have an effective theory, there's a sense in which you can run the same story I just told, where the realist can actually, the reason you know it's an effective theory is because you can basically see how it's going to approximate what you consider to be the fundamental theory. There's a lot of felicitous falsehoods that go even into that approximation process, but I take it the realist is going to have some claim to saying we've got part of the unobservable world right with these effective theories. Yeah.
Thanks so much. There's so much food for thought there.
Sorry if it was too much physics.
Yeah. Doing the Mandeville and the philosophy of science. That's terrific. Thanks so much, Professor Dumitru. We're listening.
Yeah, thank you very much for your great talk. A lot of technical stuff that we should read very carefully and thoroughly in order to understand the details of the arguments. So my concern, my worry is stemming from an attitude such that the one articulated by Kit Fine in the question of realism,
okay, I don't know this.
About the methodology of how we engage into this debate. Because most of the philosophical stuff that you touched upon is this kind of dialogue, rational dialogue between a realist and an anti-realist.
Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering, is there any place in your explanation for this kind of approach, which is called quietism,
Mm-hmm.
the one which was expounded by John McDowell or Simon Blackburn, mostly in ethics, you know,
Mm-hmm.
to the effect that there is no real issue between realist and anti-realist. So
Yeah.
you didn't use the concept of the word, but it seemed to me that at some point the way you directed the presentation was towards that kind of position, that kind of in-between position, realism and anti-realism.
Yeah. So I don't know where I stand on, like, if you just want to have a debate about scientific realism and anti-realism without concerns about understanding, I think there might be, I don't know that I would end up in the same place that, so Blackburn's actually written about this in the scientific realism debate as well. I don't know if I would end up in the same place there. Arthur Fine might be another person that you mentioned in this. Is that who you had in mind? I thought I heard Kit. Okay. Yeah. So Arthur Fine has a quietist position in the scientific realism debate.
Is the ontological attitude, yes.
Yes, the natural ontological, exactly. I don't know where you end up if your main concern is about adjudicating the scientific realism and anti-realism debate. And this is why I don't think I'm a full-fledged voluntarist in the way that Bas and Anjan are, Chakravarti, Van Frassen and Chakravarti. I think, though, for the this might be the way that I would put it, is with every philosophical discussion, there's going to be some things that you black box, and this seems like actually a very good thing to black box in this particular kind of debate, is the way I would put it. Just in the same way that when epistemologists talk about justified true belief, often their focus is on justification. They don't necessarily have a lot to say about theories of truth or theories of belief. And I think that's sort of how I would like people to proceed when it comes to understanding. It seems to me like at some point, really what's doing, I think this is probably where I have, I feel the pull of being maybe more of an anti-realist. What seems to be doing most of the work are actually the successful empirical tests in terms of the quality control on the explanons. I get that, but I also don't think that there's anything wrong. Like scientists have pretty good canons of inference, and so if they're willing to actually accept a model on the basis of those empirical tests, I think that's a good reason to accept it. So that's where I feel the instability. I feel it much more as these are substantively different views. I think you can tease them out. I think saying that they're the same thing is, I find it to be a little intellectually lazy, if I can be honest with you. I think that they're distinct views. It's just not clear to me how we go about adjudicating between them. And I feel very strongly that understanding debates aren't going to be the place that you do that. That would be, I guess, my main view with respect to this. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks so much to Professor Dumitru for the question and to Kareem for the answer. Professor Khalifa. And so the next question comes from Monica. Monica, please go ahead. Dr. Solomon.
Oh, hello. So I'll be brief. I haven't read your book, so I was just having a look at it right now because I have a question that I really want an answer to. The kinds of examples that you gave, I'm trying to fit them whether you start with saying understanding why P means unscientific analogic knowledge that Q correctly explains P. And I was wondering what that P stands for. Whether it stands for something that's like an item or a proposition or something else, something like an individual. And then the examples about the whole models, and it was like they were too complicated for me to grasp the details. But it was like, they seem not to be necessarily about, I would struggle to specify what P would be in that case. Let me put it this way, because it seems to be like about broad theory. So you're almost like, do you understand the model of scattering? Do you understand, this theory of proton?
Oh, okay.
And I wonder, so I was wondering whether, how fine-grained you want P to be. It's just a proposition, or is it something more like a topic or discipline or theory?
Oh, thank you. I was thinking of it I think of it as propositions. So Bjorken scaling is shorthand because that looks nicer on a slide, but it would be without getting it detailed about it. That the curves from the experiment turned out in such and such a way, right? Would be like one way that you could cash that out as a proposition, for instance. You could even add more to that if you wanted. That there are certain invariances of such and such a sort in these experimental results, right?
And then I want to push back against that, because that seems like a very simple statement, but the deeper you go into it, you might actually end up with specifying a whole theory that makes it. So I'm just
I don't think so.
I wonder whether you want to make it just isolated. Just
I disagree with that. There's two equations that characterize Bjorken scaling. Yeah, that's it.
So the equations are really the subject of understanding in that case.
Yeah, which are propositions, right? They're expressing identities between certain things when you take certain things to limits. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
And just as a quick follow-up, all that's left to clarify is what is a proposition?
Yes, yeah. Hank and I have very sophisticated views on that.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks so much, Monica and Kareem. And next up, we have a question from Maria Martinez Ordaz. I hope I'm saying it right.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Kareem, for your talk. I was only wondering how much can we extend these two views, Hank's and yours, into more formal realms, especially in cases in which we don't have like very neat objects of study, and we have the impression of having understood things. For instance, in these cases in mathematics that are going to introduce defective entities, such as inconsistent entities or vague entities and so on. And my question is, because in these cases, you don't have empirical adequacy, for instance, but you get the impression that the explanations are, in a sense, virtuous, and that mathematicians and logicians have understanding. And then you can still keep moving forward to more formal areas of empirical sciences in which you might have these types of scenarios as well. So I was wondering if you have any
That's good.
Yes.
That's good. I haven't developed this, but I've thought about it. So if you grant that there are formal explanations, like mathematical explanations, then I think the view you can start to see how you would transpose this. I mostly know about where the bodies lie when you do that, then I can tell you how it works. But the idea is very roughly, on my view, you have to consider different mathematical explanations and be able to engage in reliable comparisons of them. Talking about what reliable comparison means in a formal discipline ends up being tricky, because we tend to use things like safety, which are modal notions, which don't work very well for necessary propositions. So that's one place where the bodies are buried. And I haven't ever worked that out. I really need like someone who actually does the epistemology of mathematics to talk me through all the pitfalls and dangers of that. In the case, I mean, you obviously have pretty invariant generalizations in physics, for instance, when you talk about this stuff. But you also have really high-powered experiments, which really kick the tires on those sorts of invariances. I mean, the Bjorken scaling example is actually a very nice instance of that, where right, the evidence can really kind of only go one way, and so your belief forming process as a result, right? I don't even want to use the word belief there, but hypothesis testing process, let's call it that, is such that it's actually going to leave open, things can only go so many ways in terms of the nearby possible worlds that result from that. And I think there's ways of cashing out safety, which is, as Stephen mentioned, I'm also quite sympathetic to that view. In sort of more statistical veins as well, which works out very well, obviously, with experimental results. I don't know how it's going to work out with mathematics. That's something I like I said, I really want to buddy up with an epistemologist of mathematics to figure some of that out at some point. That'd be great. But thank you for your question.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Maria and Kareem. And we have the next question, and with your permission, that might be the last, from Rihad. Rihad, for all you.
All right, Ricard is a little bit of he's a bit of a troublemaker, so I don't know if I want him to be my last question. Okay, I'm just teasing. I'm just teasing. Please.
Well, make sure to just give him about 10 or 15 minutes.
Okay. Yeah. Hi, Kareem.
Hey, how are you?
Sorry. Yeah, I will not be a troublemaker. I hope. So I was thinking that probably it would have been more clear if you would have. Had the example that you discuss in your book in the chapter where you're discussing Hank's theory and his references, his position in this matter. I mean the one regarding the phlogiston theory, right? And there probably you as you put it there, you try there to argue. Of course, you have your argumentative strategy there. I'm not going, and you didn't got into the details now, but they probably the contrast is much better because as you try there to argue, the phlogiston, right, in the exponents of direct theory, of the phlogiston theory, right, according to the Rex, where the phlogiston plays the central role, right, in the exponents. Meanwhile, you will try to get it out in a way, yeah, and to play it to, using Chang's suggestion, right, on his history of phlogiston theory, and to play it on, you say there, if we were to be truly Whiggish, we would recognize phlogiston as the precursor of free electrons, right? So or phlogiston served as an expression of a chemical potential energy, which the weight-based compositionism of the oxygenist system completely lost sight of, right?
So basically, as I see it, the response you're talking about there, it basically appeals to a certain kind of semantic externalism, where obviously how you describe the thing can be pretty off, but you're still latching on to reality through a reliable, causal chain of reference or something along those lines. What's been interesting is that was in response to something Hank wrote in 2015. In his book, he actually retrenches a little bit and revises his view. He says, well, the reason why phlogiston doesn't provide understanding is because it's empirically inferior, that it's somehow inadequate when compared to the oxygenist kind of approach, which I think that's the right thing to say, actually, if you're an empiricist. Is you don't need to say, well, it's wrong because it fails to provide understanding because it's false. You say it fails to provide understanding because it falls short of empirical adequacy. So that strikes me as actually a better response for Hank. I mean, my own inclination is that, because I think my own thought was, I've said this to Hank, like I clutched my pearls the first time he said that he thought phlogiston provided understanding. I'm like, that seems like misunderstanding. If anything, it does. I mean, so I sort of welcomed when he said, like, all right, that doesn't work that way. And note that this fits better with the kind of voluntarist position, to the extent that you're not disagreeing about whether something counts as a case of understanding why, and you're only disagreeing about, like, in virtue of what do you have understanding. That gets you, that allows the voluntarism, I think, to shine through. I think it's when there's actual disagreements, like this is a case of understanding why and this isn't. But I think in almost all of those cases, we're asking the English phrase "understanding why" to do too much work for us. Like, I just don't think, unless the views are just simply, outlandish. But like, I think, like, for instance, with the phlogiston case, what you might say is, like, look, even if I'm a realist, I can play the anti-realist game and critique you internally and say, this is empirically inadequate. Why are you saying that this is providing understanding, right? And so there's those kinds of moves that you can make, and you can do that obviously as a voluntarist, and that's essentially what I would do in those sorts of cases as well. It gets more interesting when it looks like someone has got a pretty worked out anti-realist view, and they actually are claiming something provides understanding where the realist is saying, well, it provides misunderstanding. I think those cases are few and far between. And where they happen, I think, like, there might be reasonable disagreement about the case. So where you can't engage in that kind of internal critique. That's my own sense. But thank you for your question.
Yeah, thank you very much, too.
Thanks so much, Ihag. And please join me once again in thanking Professor Kareem Khalifa for a fantastic talk. But before we do so, Stephen, was that a question? Oh, okay.
No, I was just trying to clap, but I messed up.
Okay. Okay.
Go Knicks.
So thanks again, Kareem.
Oh, thank you.
Stop recording now. And